Speaker. It's a pleasure to rise to speak in favour of the Privacy Cross-Border Information Amendment Bill on the second reading. This is obviously an amendment to the Privacy Act and is primarily about cross-border transfer of data with the aim of preventing New Zealand being used as an intermediary for the circumvention of other countries' privacy laws. This is a bill that was introduced by the Honourable Leanne Dalzell in 2008. And she's someone that's had a long interest in the issue of privacy rights, and I looked at a previous speech of hers. She talked about this as a basic human right, the right to privacy. She actually was part of the select committee that in 1993 dealt with the original Privacy Act. Of course, as well as introducing the bill, the previous Labor government also launched the Law Commission's review of privacy, which was also part of an updating and an effort to strengthen privacy law in New Zealand. Now, it is really important to note that while we hear an urgency today, and this is a good bill and one that we're supporting, it hardly seems to be top of the list of important things we need to be doing for New Zealanders at the moment. It's a little like the Motor Vehicle Amendment Bill we were discussing this morning. Good solid changes, ones that we need to make, but hardly urgent. What is more urgent is looking after the interests of New Zealanders who are struggling at the moment, who are struggling to make ends meet, and who are facing ever-increasing costs, including those imposed by this government through things like increases to GST. Now, the first reading of this bill, just to evidence the fact that this isn't really urgent, the first reading of this bill was in April last year, so it's taken all of that time to come back here. First reading, 1st of April 2009, it was referred to the Justice and Electoral Committee. Submissions were due on the 14th of May 2009. The Select Committee reported on the 30th of September 2009, and here we are, nearly a year later, having the second reading. So, again, this does not really show that this is a particularly urgent legislative change. Just while I'm talking about the Justice and Electoral Committee, I noted with interest that there were only 2 submissions on this bill. I'm assuming that means it is relatively non-controversial, but I thought that was quite interesting. Now, we absolutely accept the fact that this is important in the current economic environment and for a country like New Zealand that is so internationally connected, so reliant on international trade, on exporting, on dealing with many other countries, a country like New Zealand that has been at the forefront of building relationships where we can trade, where we have been at the forefront indeed of developing trade agreements under the previous government. So it is important that we deal with an issue that is of concern for business partners overseas and will help us with our international competitiveness. So it contributes to that aim by assuring that international business partners are assured that their customers' personal information will be protected. Now, my colleague Charles Chauvel also talked about this being seen as pro-business legislation, but other things that are seen as pro-business legislation by this government are in fact very short-sighted and ill-founded in many cases. And the example I want to give is around changes to employment legislation, changes like the matter I was referring to earlier today around access to work sites. This may be seen by an ideological few as pro-business, but in fact is unnecessary and potentially hampers good organisation of workers so that they can get decent wages, that they can have a strong voice at work and be part of ensuring that their workplaces is more productive. So I consider that to be very anti-business actually. But anyway, going back to this particular bill, the Privacy Cross-Border Information Amendment Bill, essentially, as I say, dealing with cross-border transfer of personal data, and it also includes the ability to enforce cross-border provisions around privacy laws. So that's important, so we are able to take action where there is a potential for breach. So essentially it stops New Zealand being used, or is intended to stop New Zealand being used as an intermediary for the avoidance of other states' privacy laws by removing current restrictions on who can request private information, by enabling public sector agencies to charge for making personal information available to overseas foreign nationals, to provide for the referral of cross-border complaints to the appropriate privacy enforcement authority, and establishing a mechanism for controlling the transfer of information outside of New Zealand where the information has been routed through New Zealand to circumvent the privacy laws of the country from where the information originated. So the issue of privacy is an important one, and I'm sure, and I think the voting on this will show that we all recognise that privacy is important. And over time, the ability for us to have our privacy undermined has grown as the ability to store and transfer data and also the surveillance of individuals has increased. So this is the sort of legislation that does actually require constant consideration. It's a bit like the consumer legislation earlier this morning, the Motor Vehicles Amendment Bill, that things change very quickly, and so it is timely that we look at this. I think it would be interesting for people to consider how in even 5 years the flow of information around the world has sped up and the magnitude of those information flows has increased. So privacy is important, and this legislation is part of both considering whether our legislation is robust enough, and clearly we've come to the decision it is not, but also part of future-proofing our Privacy Act to ensure that we take account of changed circumstances globally. So these are reasons we are supporting this legislation. In an era of increasing globalisation and e-commerce, our ability or our inability currently to give privacy assurances to our trading partners is a potential impediment to trade. And one of the particular matters that this bill deals with and that Select Committee considered is that the European Union has particularly stringent requirements in relation to this area. And of course the bill takes that into account in its provisions. So privacy laws and getting them right is important for both individuals and for businesses. And businesses have to be able to ensure that the benefits obtained by the use of new technology do not compromise individuals' expectations for security and in the use of their personal information. So, as I mentioned earlier, this bill complements the Law Commission's review of privacy laws. And I do have to say that there is more work to be done on that, I think. Just to reinforce the point I made earlier as well, that this is yet another bill that arises from work done by the previous government, the Labor government. There have been many of them this week, and so it's interesting to see what the government will do in terms of substantive and positive forward-looking legislation of their own. So the main provisions of the bill, certainly providing the Privacy Commissioner with the discretion to prohibit the transfer of personal information from New Zealand to another state if the Commissioner is satisfied that is going to undermine, breach OECD guidelines, for example, governing the protection of privacy, or may circumvent privacy or data protection laws of the state from which it has been or will be received. So the Privacy Commissioner gets some new powers in this bill. The Commissioner may not prohibit the transfer of information, however, where the transfer is required or authorised by any enactment, convention or other instrument imposing international obligations on New Zealand. So there's a limit to the ability of the Commissioner to prohibit that transfer in that particular situation. Currently, our Privacy Act provides that an individual must be a citizen or permanent resident of New Zealand to make a request under our Privacy Act, and that is a request to obtain confirmation of whether or not an agency holds personal information, to be given access to personal information, or to correct that personal information. So, of course, that changes under this bill, which is very important, and removes that residence restriction to enable foreign nationals to access that information.
I'm sorry to interrupt the honourable member. Her time has expired.